Okay, well, now we're looking to think outside the box a little bit. So, what are some of the underrepresented areas in the ESG market?
Yeah, so I think in the ESG space, climate change is definitely one of the most common topics that's discussed, and really, in a lot of cases, just sort of overtakes any kind of discussion on any other aspects, particularly with companies that play in the fossil fuel space. So, I think for us, it's really important that we have a really strong foundation in all areas of the ES&G, and so not getting too distracted by the shiny new topic that's sort of coming out, and really maintaining a focus on health and safety and diversity, modern slavery in the social space. But I also think in the last 18 months to 2 years with COVID, and with the impact on Australian and global kind of workers and workforces, we've really seen a change, or we've really seen an increase in the amount of attention that's being paid to workforce structure and the type of workforces that make up businesses. So, through COVID, we saw lots of people that worked in part-time or casual workforces, being out of a job and not having a lot of safety nets to kind of help them through this time. We also saw a greater kind of risk from a health and safety perspective when companies used labour hire or contract models. And that's really because, and we saw that sort of in the hotel quarantine situation, and with cleaners and things like that on site. And the reason for that is really because there can be a disconnect between, corporate policy and what's happening down on the ground when you've got, maybe 3 layers of management or companies that sort of sit between the higher level corporate and the people on the ground. So, not that it's necessarily an underrepresented area workforce, but I'm not sure that workforce structure is a topic that's being asked about all of the time in the ESG space. We now, as standard, when we sort of talk to particularly our global companies, because they do often have much more complex workforce structures and factory locations, and they're just much larger, we now ask as standard, what their structure is, what percent of their employee base are contract versus direct employees. Do they measure things like health and safety for their contractors as well as for their employees? And we've been really surprised that a lot of the time we get a bit of a blank face or a bit of a blank look when we ask the question, because I think that it's not something that's necessarily coming up on the agenda from an ESG front, all the time. So that's an area that we think is very important. And it obviously goes to modern slavery and human rights issues as well. The better understanding that we can get of a company's workforce, then the better understanding we can have of the, different human rights and modern slavery risks that might be present.
I actually think it's really interesting and really topical at the moment. You hear a lot of stories coming out of Amazon's business structure. You hear a lot of stories coming out of the structure of Uber Eats and Deliveroo, and that workforce that's primarily freelance, casualized workforce in a way, and have very little protections. And you're seeing that come through.
Yeah, most definitely. And that probably just points to, I guess, the second area that, again, isn't necessarily underrepresented, but I think is just growing in interest, and something that we're definitely becoming much more interested in, and that's company culture. So, in the last sort of 12 months, there was a number of quite significant issues with Australian-based companies. There was Rio Tinto and Juukan Caves. There was the Cleanaway and the CEO being accused of bullying. There was issues with Crown Casino. And really all of those issues were tied back to company culture, and a breakdown in that culture in some way. So I think that's a really interesting space that is not necessarily something that's very easy to measure, but something that we're really starting to take a lot more focus on and starting to pay more attention to.
How do you plan to pay attention to that? You may not have structures in place to measure it now, but what are sort of the key factors that you would look for in a company with good company culture?
Yeah, look, it is a really hard, it's a really hard thing. You know, obviously the way that we access, because company culture isn't something that you can read about in a report necessarily. Companies might present their, you know, 5 pillars of culture, but it doesn't really tell you what it's like to work there. So, you know, we have really generally have very good access to senior management, including board level, the sort of CEO level, and then down to sort of executives and sustainability managers or whatever within the business. So, you know, we do ask questions related to this. And I think specifically starting to look now more closely at things like employee engagement metrics. So this is something that we've seen Cleanaway do. So since the issues with Cleanaway and Vic last year, and obviously him stepping down in, it was January, just after Christmas, they have now regularly in their quarterly updates to the market disclosed on annual turnover rate. They've disclosed on their employee engagement metrics and, you know, their satisfaction metrics. And they've also started, you know, disclosed more on their diversity metrics as well, because that was another criticism, you know, of the business. So, you know, those metrics are a very good way to at least get an indication of whether companies themselves are aware of how employees feel and how they work. And then the other way, I guess, that we really are trying to look at this is how kind of because obviously sustainability strategies generally at a business level will include, you know, things like our people and how satisfied people are in the workforce. Do they have diversity programs, and are they supporting education and things like that? So it's quite important for companies to link those strategies back to their governance, their corporate governance, and making sure that there's board ownership from top down, making sure these things are linked to KPIs. They're actually built into their accountability frameworks. And, you know, therefore you can see that it naturally sort of flows through the business. So they're the ways that we're sort of trying to think about it, having the appropriate responsibility at the executive level. But yeah, it is a really hard thing to measure.